Before there were hospitals, before there were pharmaceutical compounds, before there was any understanding of germ theory or cellular biology or the mechanism by which one person's illness could become another's, human beings got sick. They got very sick. They got sick in ways that killed them quickly and in ways that killed them slowly, and they did so without the frameworks that modern people take for granted for understanding what was happening to their bodies and why. And yet, they healed. Not always, not reliably, but with a frequency that cannot be entirely explained by spontaneous recovery alone. The archaeological and anthropological record is full of evidence of people who sustained injuries and survived them, people who developed serious infections and recovered from them, people who lived with chronic conditions that would have been immediately disabling without some form of care. Ancient humans were not simply waiting to die when they got sick. They were doing something. What they were doing is one of the most revealing and least understood chapters in the story of our species. Because the history of healing is not simply the history of ineffective superstition being gradually replaced by effective science. It is something far more interesting and far more complicated than that. It is the story of a species developing sophisticated systems for understanding and responding to illness within the constraints of what could be observed, what could be tested through trial and error, and what made sense within the larger frameworks through which those cultures understood the world and the human body's place in it. Some of what ancient healers did was spectacularly wrong. Some of it was surprisingly right. And some of it was right for reasons that ancient practitioners would not have recognized and that modern science has only recently begun to understand. Let's begin at the very beginning. Long before the first civilizations, long before writing, in the deep past of our species, before we were Homo sapiens at all. The archaeological evidence for healing behavior among early hominins is sparse but striking. In sites dating back hundreds of thousands of years, researchers have found skeletal remains showing evidence of bone fractures that had healed. The healing of a serious fracture requires weeks of immobility and sustained care from others. An individual with a broken leg cannot easily feed themselves, cannot defend themselves from predators, cannot contribute to group survival. For such an individual to survive long enough for the bone to fully heal, someone else had to provide food, protection, and care over an extended period. The healed fracture is therefore not just evidence of a biological process. It is evidence of deliberate caregiving behavior in populations that predate modern humans. There are specimens among the Neanderthals that make this even more striking. Multiple Neanderthal skeletal remains show evidence of serious injuries and conditions that would have been severely debilitating, including amputations, advanced arthritis, significant dental disease, and healed bone trauma. In individuals who survived these conditions for years or decades, the most famous is an individual discovered in Shanidar Cave in Iraq, dating to approximately 65,000 years ago, who showed evidence of a withered arm, extensive arthritis, and multiple healed injuries, and who appeared to have survived into what was, for the time, considerable old age. This individual could not have survived without sustained care from others. Some researchers have suggested that pollen found near the Shanidar burial indicated the individual was buried with flowers, potentially medicinal plants. This interpretation has been disputed, but the core finding remains. Here was a seriously disabled individual who survived for years in an environment of genuine physical hardship because others supported them. Whatever the mechanism of that support, it represents a form of healing attention that predates any formal medical practice by tens of thousands of years. The impulse to respond to illness and injury with active care, to do something rather than simply allow the sick to fend for themselves, appears to be among the oldest behaviors in the human lineage. It predates civilization. It predates language as we understand it. It may be one of the defining features of what we are as a social species. When we reach the period of early modern humans between 40,000 and 100,000 years ago, the archaeological evidence for healing practices becomes richer and more varied. plant remains associated with burial sites. Evidence of trepanation, the practice of drilling or scraping holes in the skull that appears in sites across multiple continents and multiple cultures, and the presence in the archaeological record of materials that are known to have medicinal properties all suggest that healing was not simply a matter of passive care, but involved deliberate intervention. Trepanation deserves particular attention because it is perhaps the most dramatic evidence we have of active medical practice in the prehistoric world. The practice of cutting or drilling into the skull was performed on living patients across dozens of sites on multiple continents, in cultures that had no contact with one another, spanning thousands of years. And here is what makes it most remarkable. Many of the skulls show evidence of bone regrowth around the opening, meaning the patient survived the procedure, sometimes living for years or decades afterward. We do not know what conditions these ancient surgeons were attempting to treat, but we know that they had sufficient knowledge of skull anatomy to perform a dangerous intracranial procedure with stone tools, sufficient understanding of which patients could survive it and which could not, and sufficient skill to execute it in ways that frequently produced living patients. Across virtually every ancient culture for which we have detailed records, the understanding of illness was embedded within a larger cosmological framework. Disease was not understood as a random biological process. It was understood as meaningful. It had causes that connected to the broader order of things, to relationships between the human and the divine, to the social fabric, to the moral condition of the person who was ill. And the healing response was correspondingly holistic. It addressed not just the physical symptoms, but the whole situation in which those symptoms had arisen. In ancient Mesopotamia, the oldest medical tradition for which we have written records, disease was understood primarily as the result of sin, of having violated a divine prohibition, or of being afflicted by a demon or malevolent spirit. The healer, called the ashipu, was fundamentally a diagnostician and a ritual practitioner. Their primary task was to identify the specific divine or demonic cause of the illness, which required reading omens and signs, and then to perform the appropriate ritual response to address that cause. Alongside the ashipu was the asu, a more practically oriented healer who worked with physical remedies, herbal preparations, poultices, and dietary recommendations. What is striking about the Mesopotamian medical corpus is how sophisticated the practical component was alongside the ritual one. The medical texts that survive from ancient Babylon and Assyria contain hundreds of prescriptions for specific conditions, many of which describe symptoms in precise clinical language that modern physicians would recognize. They describe specific plant-based remedies for specific conditions, dosing instructions, and expected outcomes. Some of these plant remedies have since been validated by modern pharmacological research as containing biologically active compounds relevant to the conditions they were prescribed for. The Mesopotamian healers were not simply performing symbolic gestures. They were also transmitting, through a ritual framework, genuine empirical knowledge accumulated over generations of trial and observation. Ancient Egypt developed one of the most elaborate and well-documented medical traditions in the ancient world. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE, but believed to be a copy of a much older text, is arguably the most remarkable medical document from the ancient world. It contains 48 cases of trauma and injury described with a clinical precision and systematic organization that genuinely shocked the scholars who first translated it. For each case, the text describes the examination findings, the diagnosis, the prognosis, and the treatment. The language is methodical and empirical. The text explicitly distinguishes between conditions that can be treated, conditions that might be treated, and conditions where treatment is not recommended. This is sophisticated triage logic, organized around careful observation rather than ritual. The Ebers Papyrus, another ancient Egyptian medical text, covers a much broader range of conditions, including internal medicine, mental illness, gynecology, and ophthalmology, and contains over 700 prescriptions. Many of the plant-based remedies described in the Ebers Papyrus have been analyzed by modern pharmacologists and found to contain compounds with genuine physiological activity. Willow bark, which appears in both Egyptian and other ancient medical traditions as a treatment for pain and fever, contains salicin, which the body metabolizes into salicylic acid, the active component of aspirin. Honey, which appears extensively in ancient wound treatments across multiple cultures, is now known to have genuine antibacterial properties. Garlic, which appears in dozens of ancient medical traditions as a treatment for infections and other conditions, contains allicin, which has documented antimicrobial activity. The presence of these genuinely effective compounds in ancient remedies is not a coincidence. It is the result of thousands of years of empirical observation and refinement. Ancient healers did not know why willow bark reduced fever. They did not know that the active component was metabolized into a prostaglandin inhibitor, but they observed that it worked, and they preserved that knowledge and transmitted it across generations. The ritual framework within which that knowledge was embedded should not be allowed to obscure the empirical foundation on which it rested. In ancient India, the healing tradition known as Ayurveda, which means the knowledge of life, developed one of the most comprehensive and systematic medical frameworks in the ancient world. Ayurveda understood the body as composed of three fundamental biological forces or doshas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, whose balance determined health and whose imbalance produced disease. The diagnostic system involved extraordinarily detailed observation of the patient. Their pulse, their urine, their skin, their eyes, their voice, their behavior, and their constitutional type. The therapeutic approach was correspondingly individualized. Treatment was not simply about addressing the specific condition, but about restoring balance in the specific individual. What modern medicine has found most interesting about Ayurveda is not its theoretical framework, which does not map onto biomedical categories, but the pharmacopoeia associated with it. The Ayurvedic medical tradition developed a materia medica of thousands of plant-based compounds, many of which have been studied by modern researchers and found to contain biologically active substances. Turmeric, which has been used in Ayurvedic medicine for thousands of years as an anti-inflammatory compound, contains curcumin, which has been the subject of hundreds of modern pharmacological studies and shown to have genuine anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. Ashwagandha, used in Ayurveda to reduce stress and restore energy, has been shown in modern studies to have measurable effects on cortisol levels and markers of stress response. The ancient Indian healers did not know the mechanism by which these compounds worked, but they identified them as useful, refined their use over centuries, and transmitted that knowledge in a form that has proven durable enough to be studied by modern pharmacologists 2,000 years later. The healing traditions of ancient China developed in parallel with those of India, and with similarly extraordinary longevity. Traditional Chinese medicine, which coalesced into its recognizable form during the Han Dynasty but incorporates practices and knowledge far older, understands the body as a system through which vital energy or qi flows along pathways called meridians. Disruptions in this flow produce illness. The therapeutic aim is to restore proper flow. Acupuncture, the insertion of fine needles at specific points along the meridian pathways, is perhaps the most famous technique associated with this tradition and the one that has attracted the most rigorous modern research. The evidence for acupuncture is complex and contested. High-quality randomized controlled trials have consistently found that acupuncture produces better outcomes than no treatment for certain conditions, particularly chronic pain. More controversially, many studies have found that sham acupuncture, in which needles are inserted at random points rather than the traditional meridian points, produces outcomes similar to genuine acupuncture. This finding has been interpreted in multiple ways. Some researchers see it as evidence that the needle insertion itself, regardless of location, triggers physiological responses, including endorphin release, connective tissue stimulation, and perhaps placebo-mediated neurological effects. Others see it as undermining the specific theoretical claims of the meridian system. What seems clear is that the intervention produces real physiological effects, even if the theoretical framework through which those effects were traditionally explained does not map onto the mechanisms that modern neuroscience would identify. The pharmacological component of traditional Chinese medicine is perhaps more straightforwardly supported by modern research. The Chinese medical pharmacopoeia, which involves thousands of plant, animal, and mineral compounds combined in complex formulations, has been the source of several significant modern pharmaceutical discoveries. The antimalarial drug artemisinin, which has saved millions of lives since its discovery, and which was the subject of the 2015 Nobel Prize in Medicine awarded to Tu Youyou, was discovered through systematic investigation of traditional Chinese remedies for fever and malaria. Tu Youyou's research team identified artemisinin in sweet wormwood, a plant that had been described in Chinese medical texts as useful for treating intermittent fevers more than 1,700 years ago. This story, the 2,000-year-old remedy leading directly to a Nobel Prize-winning drug, is perhaps the most dramatic illustration of why the dismissal of ancient medical knowledge as simply superstition fails to account for what ancient medical traditions actually were. They were not superstition. They were the accumulated empirical knowledge of generations of practitioners working within the constraints of what could be observed, tested, and transmitted in their time. The theoretical frameworks they used to organize and explain that knowledge were often wrong by modern standards. But the empirical observations embedded in those frameworks were often right, and they are often right in ways that took modern science centuries to confirm. Ancient healing was not merely physical. Every major ancient medical tradition developed sophisticated understandings of the relationship between mental and physical health. The Hippocratic tradition in ancient Greece, which is often cited as the beginning of rational medicine, understood emotions and mental states as having direct effects on physical health and vice versa. Melancholy, which Hippocrates attributed to an excess of black bile, was understood as both a mental condition and a physical one. The treatment involved diet, exercise, environment, and social engagement alongside any physical remedies. The soma and the psyche were not understood as separate domains. The Ayurvedic tradition placed enormous emphasis on the role of mental states in producing and sustaining physical illness. Chronic stress, unresolved grief, suppressed emotion, and mental disturbance were all understood as disrupting the doshic balance in ways that could manifest as physical disease. The treatment of serious illness in the Ayurvedic tradition routinely involved attention to emotional and psychological states alongside the physical interventions. Modern medicine has spent much of the 20th and 21st centuries rediscovering these connections through the field of psychoneuroimmunology. The evidence is now overwhelming that chronic stress suppresses immune function, that depression is associated with increased inflammation, that social isolation produces measurable physiological deterioration, and that psychological interventions can produce measurable changes in physiological markers, including immune function, inflammatory markers, and even gene expression. Ancient healers did not have these mechanisms, but they observed the connections, and they built systems of healing that address the whole person rather than the isolated symptom. There is something important to be said about the ritual dimensions of ancient healing, not to dismiss them as ineffective superstition, but to understand what they were actually doing. The performance of healing ritual in the presence of community, the invocation of powerful forces that transcended the individual, the naming and framing of the illness within a meaningful cosmological story, all of these elements served functions that modern medicine has only recently begun to recognize and address. The placebo effect, which modern medicine initially treated as a confound to be controlled for, is now understood as a genuine physiological mechanism that operates through neurological and immune pathways. The context in which a treatment is received, the relationship between healer and patient, the expectations created by the ritual of care, all of these factors produce real physiological changes. Ancient healing rituals were not simply inert performances. They were activating these mechanisms in every patient encounter. What ancient humans actually did when they got sick was something far more sophisticated and far more effective than the comfortable modern narrative of prescientific helplessness allows. They cared for one another with a dedication that predates our species. They developed pharmacological knowledge through systematic empirical observation that modern science has repeatedly confirmed and built upon. They built comprehensive frameworks for understanding illness that address the whole person, the physical, the psychological, the social, and the spiritual. And they transmitted this knowledge across generations with sufficient fidelity that it is still being mined by pharmaceutical researchers, psychologists, and anthropologists today. The history of healing is not a story of darkness giving way to light. It is a story of human intelligence and human compassion, working within the constraints of what was knowable at each moment in history, building a body of knowledge about what it means to be sick and what it means to be helped that we are still drawing on and that we are still, in many ways, only beginning to understand.